Hey, what's up guys? My name is Gary Blackwood, aka GazzyB123. Today we're going to look at a specific spot, cutoff versus button. We're going to review a few hands, we're going to look at some stuff within the solver, talk about a couple of golden rules. You're going to learn about this spot. This is something I did recently as a module for Upswing Poker. I spent at least 15 hours working on this spot. So today we're going to look at cutoff versus button, but the module itself, cutoff versus button, MP versus button, button versus cutoff, button versus MP. A whole variety of topics. So let's get into the first hand. Like I said, we're just going to review a few hands and then we'll look at some stuff within the solver. So first hand, we're heads up versus the button. By the way, guys, I should mention that our biggest sale of the year is happening right now. All courses and tools are currently 25% off for Black Friday. So head on over to upswingpoker.com to take advantage of that right away. And don't wait too long because this sale is going to end at midnight on Cyber Monday. Okay, back to the video. We open standard 2.5x, open the cutoff, button calls, and we go heads up to the 5-4 deuce. We've got a pretty good draw here. We've got two overcards. Our two overcards are going to be live a lot of the time. People tend to 3-bet 10s and jacks a lot of the time, and then queens plus, obviously, always. So our two overcards are going to be live a lot of the time. Obviously, we've got flush outs as well. I like to check the flop, though, which is actually really standard. We'll come to why that's standard in a little second. The button elects to check back. Turn is the 10 of diamonds. Our hand is a little too strong to check now. So we elect to bet. We bet around about 2/3 pot. Not loving my turn size in hindsight. I think we should just be pretty consistent and use a 75% size. Our opponent calls. And we get a very beautiful queen of diamonds run out. And we go for, again, just a standard 75% size on the river. I think that's fine. And our opponent elects to call. Really nice river for us. We get shown pocket jacks. So let's take a little look at this within the solver. So we're going to look at a few different hand histories and a couple of different types of board and talk about some golden rules, etc. So the situation is we've opened the cutoff. The button is called. This is the flop. And as we can see in the cutoff as the pre-flop aggressor, the solver wants to check this board essentially 100% of the time. You might think to yourself that's a little strange, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that because we've opened, we're the pre-flop aggressor, which means we've got all the sets, we've got ace-3, we've got all the overpairs, we've got strong flush draws, we've got some combo draws, some very strong combo draws in the way of king-6 and ace-6 of hearts, 7-6 of hearts, etc. So you'd be forgiven for thinking, why are we checking so much when we have all these strong hands in our range? And it's interesting to note that the equity for the out-of-position player is actually really low on this board, i.e. the pre-flop aggressor. Our range has 45.5% equity, and obviously that means the in-position player has got 54.5% equity. So the in-position player is doing much better on this board than we are. And you might think to yourself, why is that? We've got all the overpairs and all the sets, etc. And we can break down a little further. Yes, we have all the overpairs and all the sets. However, if we look at our range, we have so much air on this board. We're opening 29% in the cutoff. The button is calling around about 5.5%. Which means that we've got like king 8 of clubs and queen 7 of diamonds and jack 10 offsuit and king jack offsuit, etc. All the hands that our opponent doesn't have, which means that even though we've got the same amount of strong hands, nutted hands on this board in terms of sets and straights, our air range is just so wide that the button is actually doing better. Coming back to what I was saying about this being an exception rather than the rule, if we look at the spreadsheet, just real quick side note, all the tools that we see within this video are all available within the module that I created for Upswing Poker. So I ran about 150 different flops, I think it was, and I've put them into different subsections and made them all nice and neat and pretty within this spreadsheet. So as we can see, if we look at this subsection middling low, we've got around about 30 flops, and as we can see really consistently, the in-position player, i.e. the pre-flop caller, is doing much better on all of these boards. So the first golden rule that we're going to nail down, and it's a fantastic golden rule, and a really important one, is that if we open in the cutoff and the button calls, if we look over here at the frequencies, the checking frequency is extremely high, to the point that we can simplify our strategy, and any 10 high or below flop, we can check our entire range, which is massive, absolutely massive. It means that we have got a really solid nailed down strategy on 10 high and below flops, which is like 2/3 of the flops that we're going to see. Really quick point, this is not monotone or paired boards. This is any rainbow, flush draw, unpaired, 10 high or below flop, which is a lot of flops. So coming back to the hand itself, obviously we're going to check our entire range of the flop. And now we know, 10 high and below, not paired, not monotone. We want to do a ton of checking, more so than I think a lot of people will have realized. I want to really quickly talk about what we should do if our opponent bets. The flop has gone check, check here. But if we're going to start checking really wide, we need to know how to play after that. So we're going to assume our opponent has bet. We're supposed to check raise here around about 20% of the time. Our value is really obvious. We've got some overpairs sometimes. Our sets, ace 3. Our value range is really obvious. Our bluffing range is actually really obvious as well. So on a board like 5-4 deuce flush draw, where we've got a lot of heart combos, a lot of nut flush draws and second nut flush draws, we tend to favor the nut flush draws with the weakest kicker. This is another golden rule, and I think this is fantastic advice. Not tooting my own horn, but the reason the solver wants to raise ace 7 of hearts and king 7 of hearts and king 6 of hearts before it raises ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, etc. is that, stick with me here, if you have ace 7 with the 7 of hearts, the 7 of hearts doesn't block anywhere near as many flush combos as the jack of hearts or the queen of hearts or the king of hearts. So we check call ace king of hearts, but we check raise ace 7 of hearts, because the 7 of hearts blocks less combos than the king of hearts does. The king of hearts will block king, queen, king, jack, king, 10. 7 of hearts doesn't block too many combos at all. That is quite relevant in this specific situation, but that golden rule is so relevant in all of poker. That's really, really consistent with what the solver likes to do, particularly when ranges are wider. So yeah, really good piece of advice there. So our check raising range, we want to raise our nut flush draws and our second nut flush draws and focus mainly on the combos that have the weakest kicker for blocker purposes. Coming back to how the hand played out, check, check. Turn was the 10 of diamonds. What do we want to do with our hand? We want to bet it. We want to bet it really wide. Our hand is just a little too strong to keep checking. We want to check sometimes, but for the most part, I think it's a mistake to check this as often as the solver is doing, from an exploitative point of view, of course. I think we just want to go ahead and bet really wide. Our hand has so much equity. If we look at the equity that our hand actually has here, is my head in the way? It's not. 78%. It's just too strong a hand to be checking, in my opinion. Particularly in the smaller stakes games where people are not stabbing enough, particularly when the flop goes check, check. If we check to him again, he's not going to stab anywhere near as wide as the solver does. If we do check to our opponent, he's supposed to stab around about half the time after flop goes check, check, and we check the turn. It's just not happening. It's just going to go check, 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 check so often, too often for the strength of our hand. Therefore, we want to be betting really wide. We do like to bet. Our opponent calls, and we get the queen of clubs on the river. Really easy here, guys. We don't want to mess around. So I've given the solver 2 different sizes on the river, 33 and 100%. And our hand wants to use the larger size. If we are splitting our range here, our smaller bets are really easy to work out. We've got pocket jacks, we've got some queen X on the river, and our larger bets are really easy to work out as well. We've got sets, we've got straights, we've got queen 10, obviously. So really interesting first hand. Let's take a look at the second hand, which is slightly different, but still pretty interesting. All right, let's look at a different type of flop texture. It's going to lead into some discussion about some other types of flop textures. I've deliberately chose this hand for that reason. So we open king queen off, button calls. We get the king 8-5 flush draw. We check again. Our opponent checks back. We lead out 75% on the 6 of clubs turn. Our opponent calls. And the river's the ace of spades. We check. Our opponent bets. He decides to bet pot, and I decided to call this time. We get shown a bluff, thankfully. Scoop in a nice pot. Let's break it down within the solver. Pretty interesting hand. And again, we want to check extremely wide on the flop, guys, 95% of the time. You'd be forgiven for thinking this is one of the flops that we're actually going to bet not super wide, but wider than 4%. But again, we want to check really wide, and the reason for that is, yes, we have a lot of king 3, king 4, king 5, etc. And king 10 off plus, but we still have a lot of air in our range. We're opening 29%, our opponent's calling 5.7%. Our range is so wide, it's 6 times wider than our opponent's, which means that we have so much air, and therefore we have to do a lot of checking, and that's backed up again by the equity. Combination of two things here. One, we're out of position. We don't want to do as much betting out of position than we do when we're in position. And two, our equity is low. When you add those two factors together, it equals not c-betting very often at all. So let's go through the hand in its entirety, and then we'll talk about some other stuff. So we check. Our opponent is not going to stab as often here as he is on the 10 high boards, because again, obviously, we saw 5-4 deuce. He had 55% equity. He wants to bet that really wide, but we've only got like 50, 51, something like that. You don't want to bet as wide. And as we can see, the solver prefers the larger size here. So for the point of view of the in-position player, not betting as often, more polarized equals larger sizing. Pretty standard stuff throughout the solver. In this instance, he checks back. The turn is the 6 of clubs, and our hand is way too strong to be checking here. We want to bet really wide. The solver's sort of splitting evenly. I'm not a fan of splitting range, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a subtree, which means that we're going to solve the hand from this point and change the sizes. So we want to use the 75% size for the out of position player. And because we've already solved the hand, it's really quick. We're just solving it from the turn, and this will tell us now what our turn strategy is if we only have a 75% bet. And as we can see, betting king queen super wide. So we bet, our opponent calls, and the river is the ace of spades. Really interesting to see that we actually go from big bet on the flop to block bet on the river. It's not very often in poker that we have a big bet on the turn to block on the river. Not very often that we do that in poker, and this is one of those spots. So as mentioned, not a big fan of splitting my range on the flop, not a fan of doing it on the turn. On the river, when we're out of position, we don't always have to split our range, but we can do if we want to. This is probably one of those times where it's fine to split your range. And it's kind of easy to work out what goes into the big bet size and what goes into the small bet size. Our weaker ace X goes into the small bet size. Our king X goes into the small bet size. Anything else in here that we want to block? That's essentially it. Our weaker top pairs, our stronger second pairs, and everything else is strong enough to use a larger size. We've got sets, we've got two pairs, we've got strong ace X, etc, etc. So I've actually made a mistake here. I should have bet the river always, which makes a lot of sense in hindsight because our opponent doesn't have too much ace X. There's still a tiny bit of value to be had, and it's so unlikely we're going to get raised here if we do elect to block. Let's see, they're supposed to raise 19%, which is 3.5 combos. I don't think people find that raise frequency anywhere near as much as the solver will do, which is obviously very nice. So going back all the way back to the flop, I wanted to talk about some of the different types of flops that we have. So that I want to reiterate the point, guys. This is cutoff versus button. The module that I've created is focusing on cutoff and MP. Obviously we're doing a mini module, if you will, today, so we don't have too much time, can't look at the MP stuff, but just let's break it down real quick. So under the gun opens 17% of its range, MP opens 22% of its range, and cutoff opens 29% of its range. The button's flatting frequency is relatively similar versus all three positions, stays at around about between 5.5 and 6%. So if our range is really, really wide in the cutoff versus quite a tight range in the button, how is that going to change when we're MP and our range is a little narrower? Obviously we get to c-bet a little wider, and then when we're under the gun our range is even narrower, we get to c-bet even wider then. So focusing on the cutoff where we do the most checking, let's look at some boards where we can actually bet a little wider. So the subsection ace high, again, really consistent, checking really wide on the ace high boards, betting the disconnected ace high boards a little more frequently than something like ace 8-7, for example, or ace 3 deuce. Moving on to the single broadways, we've already looked at that. We've looked at that just now. And again, Some single broadways we want to bet quite wide, and those are the king highs with the really low cards. So for example, king 3 deuce, want to bet quite wide, king 7 3, anything that's king high and disconnected essentially. And then moving on, the double broadways are the best for us. And again, as we can see, the out of position player does have the in position player has slightly more equity on some textures, but the out of position player is doing much better on these double Broadway boards compared to any other board that we've seen. So as we can see, it's clearly the in position player that is preferred on every other subsection but for double broadways, and it's really simple. I mentioned it earlier, when you've got more equity you tend to bet a little wider. So the double Broadway boards are where we want to be doing more betting, and obviously we're not pure betting, we're not betting range. We're playing some textures where we want to bet extremely wide. For example, king queen deuce, king jack 3, essentially anything that's king high double Broadway is very good for us, and that's where we want to do the most betting. We do the most checking on the connected double Broadway boards like queen jack 8 and jack 10 7, etc, etc. But pretty cool to see that this is the spot where we want to do the most betting. A huge thank you for those that joined. On behalf of Upswing Poker and myself, I have been GazzyB123. Like I say, I made a full module on this. It's available in the Upswing Lab. Looks at MP versus button, cutoff versus button, button versus cutoff, button versus MP, every different flop scenario, every different flop texture, turn strategy, in-depth hand history review, etc. That's available for Upswing members at the Upswing Lab. Head on over to upswingpoker.com to check that out. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
This weekend at Upswing Poker, it's the Black Friday sale. Get 25% off absolutely everything at upswingpoker.com.
Oh my god.
That's 25% off the lab, 25% off advanced courses, 25% off tools like the PLO Matrix.
Oh my gosh.
How about Nick Petrangelo's best-selling MTG course? It's 25% off. The sale kicks off November 25th and lasts through the 29th on Cyber Monday.
Okay. Gotta take some deep breaths.
There's no bonus code. Just go to upswingpoker.com and get 25% off whatever you want.